Welcome, eCom Logistics Nation. Thank you for joining today's episode. We're on a mission to share e-commerce logistics insights, trends, successes, and challenges from the leaders and innovators in our space.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit harder to get your vendors on board. But if you sit there collaboratively with those vendors and say, hey, as a result of you sharing your visibility data with me, that means that I can provide better service to our mutual end customers that are walking in the store looking for product.
Welcome, eCom Logistics Podcast Nation. Excited to welcome today's guest, Mark Delaney, VP Industry Strategy at FourKites. In Mark's current role, he engages with the retailer C-level leaders, serves as a SME to drive product roadmap, and supports the global sales team at FourKites. He also represents FourKites at industry events and briefings, including Manhattan Associates Momentum Conference coming up in a few weeks, where we'll be attending as well, and look forward to meeting Mark and his team in person there. Prior to FourKites, Mark was a retail industry principal at Zebra Technologies, held leadership roles at Nielsen, General Mills, and he owned his own retail technology and analytics consulting firm. Fun fact about Mark, he also serves as the mayor of a village on the north shore of Long Island where he lives with his family. Mark, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you guys. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. We might at some point get into the old mayor conversation, but before going there, Mark, we love starting our conversations with learning more and unpacking our guest's background and journey in their logistics career. You have an impressive 20-year tenure in the space, working with a lot of the major retailers around the globe, and would love if you could share with us any pivotal or transformative milestones in your career and what about the logistics industry has kept you here as well as passionate and excited?
Well, I guess, to start, never a dull moment, right?
That's right.
We're just coming off of the pandemic. That obviously caused a lot of strain, both personally and professionally, on a lot of folks, right? I started off, back in the day with Pillsbury, which was acquired by General Mills. And that's where you sort of learn about the supply chain, right? You understand how product gets from the manufacturer to the retailer to the end consumer, right? So I always found that fascinating because from a consumer standpoint, you just walk into a store and things are on shelves and you just assume that's, they're there, right? And no one ever thinks about, and I think this is something that, like living through COVID actually sort of exposed a little bit around supply chain, because all of a sudden there wasn't stuff on shelves, right? And all of a sudden we as consumers had to understand, well, wait, okay, how does a product get from, China, for example, and it goes across the ocean, then somehow it gets onto a truck or on a rail car, and somehow it gets to the back door of my supermarket, right? So we know in the supply chain business, that's an incredibly complicated journey, right? But to the average consumer, you just walk in and say, yep, there's the box of Cheerios, that's where it should be, right? So I just found it fascinating, and I was lucky to be able to find different organizations that allowed me to keep being curious, right? And then when I got to Zebra, I had the opportunity to talk to most of the major retailers on the planet because my role was global. And every single retail exec that I talked to was struggling with the same issues. How do I ensure that the product is in the right place at the right time when the consumer wants it, right? And that's really the sort of period of time we're living through, right? How do you get goods and services closer and closer to the point of demand, right? And that's been a challenge for decades, but we're finally getting to the point where, folks' expectations around delivery and things like that, largely driven by what I call the Amazon effect, where all of a sudden everyone expects everything in 48 hours. Now, I'm not sure how we got to that point as a society. Do we really need everything in 48 hours? I would argue no. But we just have that expectation. And for most retailers, that's an almost impossible game to play, right? It's extremely costly. It's very difficult to do from a logistics standpoint. But how can we get our customers to a point where they can satisfy those customer demands and get that supply chain as tight and as free-flowing as it possibly can be?
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. We talk a lot about is same day, 1 day, 2 day really necessary? In some cases it is, but in others, we're actually seeing too that segments of the market are okay with 4, 5, 6 day delivery, so long as those expectations are set up front and very clear and communicated in a well manner. So yeah, great points. Great points.
There is, just to touch on that as well, though, there is the other side of it, which is that's more to do with brands, right? When you look at retail specifically, retail's going from 2 days now to 1 day to, I think the whole same day thing's it was a pandemic thing, and I think everyone's over it at this point. Maybe it's not as much a hyper need as it used to be, but definitely it's gone from 2 days to 1 day when it comes to, general retail as the expectation is concerned out in the market.
Well, I think one of the things that Dan said is important, right? It's all about communication, right? So, I as a consumer may be perfectly fine with something taking 3, 4, 5 days to get to my home, right? But if you tell me it's going to be there on that 4th day and it doesn't show up, right? Then I'm going to take you to task, right? Because there's no reason in 2023 that you can't communicate with me, right? You got cell phones, you got text messages, you've got, right? There's 5 million ways to get a hold of any one of us, right? So use that to tell me, hey, something happened and I apologize and it's going to be a day late. Okay, at least I know, right?
Yep.
But if I just wake up that morning and I go to bed that night and realize, oh, wow, it didn't come, that's when I get angry, right?
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, although, Mark, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are aware, but for those that are not familiar with FourKites, can you just provide a brief overview of the solution you guys offer, just for their, general knowledge?
Yeah, FourKite started 8 or 9 years ago, close to a decade at this point, and we pioneered what we call sort of real-time transportation visibility, right? So the idea being that if you've got product that's coming from, let's say, Shanghai, for sake of example, right, you want to be able to see through a single pane of glass. And the single pane of glass is very important, right? Single pane of glass from when that product or that container gets loaded onto a ship off Shanghai, right, goes across the ocean, comes into the port of LA, right, sits at the port of LA for a couple of days, gets unloaded, right, goes onto a rail car, onto a truck, whatever the case may be, right? It goes to a certain retailer's DC, and then it goes from that DC to the back of the store. Right, the ability to be able to see that in one place, that's what we pioneered. And that's what we take a lot of pride in. Because if you think about it from a supply chain professional standpoint, most of that work today, right, believe it or not, is still being done on spreadsheets, right? Spreadsheets, phone calls and text messages and emails and all that kind of thing. Well, think about what's happened over the course of the last 2 years. We've seen labor, right, just absolutely disappear. Right. So all of our customers are struggling with finding enough bodies to even look at those spreadsheets or field those phone calls. So it just doesn't make any sense. If you can take that and digitize it all and have one pane of glass to be able to track that shipment from the DC to the store, right, that makes all the sense in the world. And that's what we pioneered close to a decade ago.
And before that pioneering, just to kind of dig into it, right, and even for majority of the organizations out there today, it's more ERP dependent, right? I cut a purchase order for a vendor and then basically wait for it to arrive. And the amount of visibility, of course, there's some messaging that ends up happening to say that it's in transit, as an example, to the ERP system. But you don't have true visibility to where the product happens to be or when the product actually leaves the warehouse. When is it going to get to the store? Because the ERP system's only getting general information at a high level that goes, hey, I've shipped these products going out.
Yep.
They don't really care about what trailer, right? Like what route is it taking? How is it going to get there, etc. So that's really interesting. And maybe because, at the beginning of the podcast, Dan mentioned we are going to Manhattan, right? For the Manhattan Momentum Conference.
Sure.
Could you kind of talk about, because Manhattan's also a supply chain organization, right? Like a supply chain execution organization. Can you talk about how FourKites actually works with Manhattan from a complementary perspective?
Sure. Yeah. So, Manhattan is one of our longest standing and closest partners that we work with, right? And especially within my world, which is retail, right? They have a very strong presence in retail. So in many cases, we're talking to the same customers, right? Or we already have the same customers. So the earliest integration was simply where they had their TMS, right? And we integrated our visibility solutions into that TMS so that at the end of the day, it provides better visibility to our end customers, our mutual customers, across various nodes. So whether it be truck or rail or boat or whatever the case may be. Now, more recently, and I'll say within the last year or so, we've had a lot more conversations around how the supply chain visibility can drive cost out of the system, drive efficiencies, et cetera. And we're also talking about how to integrate to their new Active platform, which is something I'm sure they'll be talking about a lot at the conference. So very close partnership. We work very closely together. One of the gentlemen, one of my peers, actually comes out of Manhattan. He was there for, I think, close to a decade. So, we have very good C-level relationships, and we're very much partners when it comes to our end customers.
That's amazing.
Love it. Love it. and look forward to meeting you in person, Mark, in a few weeks. I want to go back to the whole visibility discussion, because I think at the end of the day, all the work that we do in logistics, distribution, fulfillment is centered around a single goal of driving end customer value and achieving that the experience that the customer demands. And again, that customer might be a surgeon who needs the right equipment. It might be, to your point, Mark, me in a grocery store grabbing my box of Cheerios. It might be someone that ordered a t-shirt on dancalltshirt.com. No, that does not exist. Fictitious business name. And, that visibility is a huge piece. And I love how you said, I think we see a lot of organizations still using Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheets today. And, a lot of my past life has been working in the 3PL world. And that was a massive issue, is get notification of a PO dropping or an ASN would be entered into our WMS, with an estimated delivery time or day, but it was very estimated, and rarely was it ever hit. And that caused massive issues with labor planning and, just being able to have continuity throughout the warehouse. Because again, you're not just fulfilling or doing warehousing for one client, you're doing it for hundreds or thousands. So would love to get your thoughts on just the overall importance of visibility and how that visibility does end up driving a better end customer experience, whoever that customer is.
Sure. Well, first on the one point, the fact that some of this is still done on spreadsheets and using phone calls and emails and all that kind of thing, right? Think about what we have on these things, right? So I can pull up Waze on my phone, right? And I can see on my screen exactly where I am down to like half a block accuracy, right? Mm-hmm. That's just on my phone, right? It'll even tell me where the police are. Not that I have anything against them, but it'll tell me where they are, right?
Well, you are the mayor. You are Mayor Mark. Exactly, right.
So we have visibility, right? So why on earth do we have that visibility in our everyday lives and not expect that from our carriers and from the supply chain world in general? So that's number one. Number two is what happened during COVID. Everyone's loyalty shattered, right? Because all of the things that we rely on day to day, whether it be toilet tissue or cereal or whatever the case may be, right, all of a sudden wasn't there on the shelf. So you may have gone to the same store for 10 or 15 years, right? And all of a sudden now you're forced to go to other stores just because you can't find what you want on the shelf. So all of a sudden, me as a customer, I would go into a different store that I normally wouldn't shop, and I'd be looking around the store. I'd be like, wow, this is actually a pretty nice store. Why didn't I ever come here before, right? And all of a sudden now my loyalty shifts because it was forced to shift. So now when we're finally coming out of, what we'll call post-pandemic, right? Number one priority for many retailers is to say, okay, there's two approaches. One, how do I regain the loyalty that I lost? Right? And looking at it more opportunistically, how do I steal customers away from my competitors, right? Because I've been able to sort of break that loyalty, right? So there's a huge focus right now on just meeting customer demand. And as we start to get back into stores and we start to, rely a little bit less on e-commerce, not that that's going away by any stretch, but we do enjoy going back into stores for certain things, right? The key to that, though, is are you in stock? Right? How many times have you gone online with a retailer, right? And maybe it's a part that you need at a home improvement store. And it says, oh, well, there's 6 in stock. Perfect. So you jump in the car, you drive 10 or 15 minutes down the road, you get there, you walk into the store, 0. Mm-hmm. How can you do that? Right? That's basic visibility. And in our eyes, from a FourKites perspective, that's just table stakes, right? You need to have that level of accuracy at the store, because otherwise you have that consumer who now jumped in their car, drove 10 minutes away, walked into the store, right? Now you've given them a terrible experience. And because that loyalty has been shattered, there's a very good chance that they're going to go across the street to your competitor. So if you talk about that whole idea of what keeps the execs up at night, that's what keeps people up at night. How do I get those customers back that I lost? And how do I gain customers away from my competitors? And the only way I can do that is making sure that their expectations are met every time they step into the store. Now, much harder than it sounds, as we know as supply chain professionals, but that's what customers are expecting, right? Because unfortunately, that Amazon effect that I talked about before, right? I know I can log on to Amazon, or I can get it in the app. I know that it's, 1 hour away, 2 hours away, 3 hours away, or something happened and it's not going to be delivered till tomorrow. That's the expectation that has been set with consumers, and you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, no, I agree. Though, something you touched on where as supply chain professionals, we know it's much harder to do at this point, right? To the point you said that the data should be visible and available, right? Similar to your Waze example. What we notice in the market is the last mile data has greater visibility now, right? Like there is lots of tools and APIs and whatnot that's available for any delivery that is happening, as an example. And you can become better and better. And if you depend on your FedExes or UPSs, etc., even their tools are getting better. There is a lot of last mile carriers that are getting better with visibility. So there is that first mile of the supply chain, which at least, my impression, and I don't play in that space, and I'm trying to, be educated on this, is my impression is it's still stuck in the good old days, right? So it's all still EDIs, communication's fairly limited. Even the vendors, their ability to provide granular data does not seem to be there. What's changing right now from your perspective?
Well, I think it is a data game, right, at the end of the day, right? Because if you think about the amount of data that we ingest, right, and I'm going to do a selfish little plug for a second, one of our biggest investors and partners is FedEx. Yep. So we actually get a lot of FedEx's data, and we can provide better ETAs to their customers than they can themselves via their public API. So that's a fantastic partnership. What we pride ourselves on is we have this idea of what we've termed visibility everywhere. Right. And if you think about all the data points that we ingest, we're ingesting data not only from the carriers, right, from telematics, things like that, but we're ingesting weather data, right? We're ingesting traffic data, right? So the idea being that, the carrier may say to, a retailer in Pittsburgh, for example, that, I'm going to have it there tomorrow at 6 p.m. But we can see in our data, well, it's Pittsburgh and it's February and it's snowing. Right. So we know through our predictive ETAs, it's not going to be there at 6, right? It's going to be there maybe at 11 if they're lucky, right? Think about that from the customer standpoint. Now they can take that labor that is so hard and so expensive to find, right? And they can reallocate that labor more efficiently to make sure that the crew is ready to unload the truck at 11 instead of having a crew standing around by the bay doors at 5 or 6 o'clock saying, well, wait, where's the truck? Right?
Exactly.
Right. That's bonkers that in 2023, we can't tell them that. So that's sort of, that's the underpinnings of our solution.
And what about the vendor side data quality, right? Like where one of the things I was reading on your website as an example is more SKU level data tracking, right? There is also the granular visibility. I think from, a distribution node to a retail node, I think there is greater visibility already there, right? Like, what the ASN data consists. Right. But when it comes over the ocean, it almost feels like it's just high-level load data that does not really give me all that granular information. Yep. So what's the vantage point? How is it changing? How can people use that level of data to do better planning?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things, right? I think one is, and I think the pandemic taught us some of this, I think there's a lot more willingness to share data now than in the past. I mean, if you think about my background, when I was with Nielsen, for example, it was like to get a retailer to share their data with us was a huge, huge effort, right? You had to establish all sorts of trust and in a lot of cases pay them and things like that, whatever, that's the past, right? But now a lot of customers are now sharing data with each other more, like, I guess I would say more willingly. And there are even platforms, for example, where a retailer may go on to that one of their competitors is on, but they're okay to get onto that platform because it's all for the greater good, because they want to get better insights out of it. So, one of the things that we spend a lot of time working on and pride ourselves on is data quality, right? There's a ton of data out there. I mean, the amount of data that we throw off from just our mobile devices alone, tracking us and knowing where we are and things like that, right? That's a lot of data to ingest. And you mentioned the ocean stuff, right? Well, tracking a ship across the ocean is not really that difficult. Now, it's a little bit different because you're talking in terms of days and weeks and in terms of, hours and minutes. But there's no reason why that data can't be ingested and served up. And that's what we do. And I think it's getting better because a lot of the BI tools are more sophisticated than they were in the past. And, if you just think about the sheer amount of data that we have, I mean, if you go back even 5 or 10 years, right, if you talked about a terabyte of data, that was like, holy cow, a terabyte of data, right? I have a flash drive that I use when I travel that is like, I think it's either 1 or 2 terabytes.
Yep.
So it's like, okay, I'm carrying that around in my backpack, right? That used to be a data warehouse 10 years ago. So it's just, and being able to handle that amount of data takes a lot of effort. And so not all organizations are up to it yet.
That's really interesting. Just as a side anecdote, right? I remember just about 10 years ago when in-memory analytics was all the rage. Why? Because storing data was expensive.
Yeah.
So it was all about memory was cheaper than actually disk,
Yep.
right? And so everyone was all rage about in-memory analytics.
Right.
And that's nowhere to be seen today because disk is so cheap.
Exactly. We'll just think about our phones, right?
Yeah.
We basically put Kodak out of business because we are now taking all of our pictures of our loved ones, our kids, whatever, on the phone. And you know what? They just go up to the cloud, and I never even think about it. I just, doesn't even, right? So, if you tell one of my kids that there was a time when I actually took a roll of film to the local drugstore to have it, right? They look at you like you have three heads. Like that wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't.
That's
exactly
true.
So,
and it's also consistent, right? Like, not to get really off track, but even the evolution of storing pictures online, there used to be like Yahoo photos that would give you like 100 MB of storage at like 3 megapixel or something of that nature. And I tried to go back to it, and it's no longer there. Some of my pictures from back in 2000 are lost, right?
Right.
But since you adopted, Apple Pictures or Google Photos, I think it's perpetual at this point. Sorry, I'm kind of getting off track, but it's close to my heart for sure.
Mark, I want to go back to something you had said, which was very strategic, and maybe talk about the tactical. And I've heard you actually stayed in other podcasts I've listened to, and I heard your new president, Rocky, talk about this on the video you guys have on FourKites, is the importance of listening to consumers and to customers. And so now that we're in this post-pandemic supply chain era, if that's what we're going to call it, would love to hear what the market is telling you is important about visibility. And, there's assumptions I have, is it labor savings, space reduction, just-in-time inventory strategy, but would love to hear from you what the market and your customers are sharing with you and how maybe that's driving some of your future innovation.
Sure. Yeah, well, one other area on top of the ones that you already mentioned are also, and is also top of mind with our customers these days, is employee satisfaction, right? Because it's very expensive to lose a good employee, especially someone who's been there for a period of time. You invest in all that training and that sort of thing. So for them to be mired down by spreadsheets and phone calls and text messages and all that, if you can give them that single pane of glass view and you can give them that visibility and the confidence that they're communicating to their customers something that's accurate, right? They feel better as associates, and you keep those associates longer, right? And you don't have to spend a lot of money training them and all that sort of thing. So that's one sort of interesting side benefit. But one thing that's really cool about where we are, as a journey right now as an organization is, so this year, and Rocky probably touched on it, we're going from what I'll call load level information to now order and SKU level information. And that comes from our customers' feedback, right? So if you think about it, if you're a transportation or supply chain person, right, you only think in terms of loads, right? Because that's how that world operates, right? The container gets onto a ship in Shanghai and gets to the port of LA. That's what it does, right? But if you're a merchandiser or operations type of person, right, you think and talk in terms of orders and SKUs, right? Because you're concerned that your order of flat screen TVs that are in the Black Friday ad, right, you want to make sure that that entire order is going to be received. But that order could be split across 3 or 4 containers. So to transportation and supply chain, the container is very important. To merchandising and operations, the order and SKU is very important. And what that helps us do is better serve our customers, because now it's not just the transportation and supply chain people who are ingesting that information. It's operations, it's merchandising, it's customer service, things like that. So what happens is now as an organization, we're actually helping them communicate more effectively internally. And again, going back to the employee satisfaction piece, if you have confidence in all the various departments that you work with within your organization, right, you feel better as a person, you feel better as an employee, you feel like you're getting more accomplished. And that's what we're essentially being able to do by providing that next level of detail that we just started providing this year.
That is amazing. And again, this goes back to, right, you can only provide that detail if the detail is available to you.
Correct. Yep.
Right. And maybe just to dig into that part, right? So when you think about, Coca-Cola as an example, as a customer of yours, and also large retailers that we might talk about, Walmart as an example. See, they have control over putting together vendor programs that say, as part of being a vendor with me, you need to be able to do this. What happens to the mid-market and below, right? Like that independent brand that's trying to create that? Like maybe going beyond a little bit on the beyond FourKites. What would be your recommendation to these brands or retailers that are just starting out? They don't have the purchasing power to control as much of the vendor behavior. Mm-hmm. How do you get that data? Like, how do you put a program together?
Well, so it's all about showing value at the end of the day, right? I mean, you're right. If you're Walmart or Sam's Club or Kroger or Albertsons, whatever, yeah, sure. You can put a letter out to your vendors and your vendors are going to say, okay, yes, sir, I will do that, right? If you're a smaller regional player that's only 200 or 300 stores or something like that, yeah, it's going to be a little bit harder to get your vendors on board. But if you sit there collaboratively with those vendors and say, hey, as a result of you sharing your visibility data with me, right, that means that I can provide better service to our mutual end customers that are walking in the store looking for product, right? And it's like the world has changed a little bit as a result of the pandemic too, right? Because, I mean, think about stores and circulars, right? You don't walk into a store anymore and find a circular sitting there. They just went away, right? So, and that though, within the context of the retailer and manufacturer relationship, that also means a profit center got lost, right? Because those manufacturers got charged to have their product actually in that circular on a Sunday or whatever the case may be, right? So they have to figure out a way to replace those revenue streams. And the only way that you can do that is by sort of enabling this visibility and trust and making sure that at the end of the day, the mutual end customer, which is, you and I walking into the clothing store, the home improvement store, the grocery store, and having a good experience, right? That benefits not only the retailer, but it benefits the brand that we picked up and walked out the door with.
That makes complete sense. And that's some real sage advice. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about robotics, right? Because I saw a statement from you. You said, what was it? The amount of AMRs at ProMat were overwhelming. I got the same feeling. But interestingly, I'll also say this. Half the ones that were at Modex last year weren't here this year, right? Like, so it's like also this revolving door, but there is a lot happening in the robotic space. So it seems like you have some deep insights on that side. Like I would love to get your vantage point on the robotic side. I definitely have one.
Right. Well, I mean, walking around the ProMat floor, if I was someone who had to decide on an AMR vendor, I would be popping Tylenol like crazy. It's just every turn you made, right? Like down another aisle, there was 2, 3, 4 providers, and they were all slightly different, and they could all do something slightly differently, right? But at the end of the day, they were just all, they were basically doing the same thing, right? And from a use case perspective, anyway. Yeah. I think the other interesting area too, and this is driven by the labor shortage, is some of these retailers having to automate. Right? They simply can't fulfill e-commerce fast enough using human labor because they don't have enough bodies. And oh, by the way, those bodies that they do have, they would much rather use them to actually serve customers instead of just pulling boxes off of the shelf, right? So you look at micro-fulfillment, for example. Micro-fulfillment is on a tear, right? CAGR's in the 110% range. I mean, crazy growth, right? But the reason that is happening is because they don't have the labor, and you and I as consumers have much higher expectations around that delivery. So we do want it the same day, or we do want it certainly the next day, right? And guess what? We're not necessarily willing to pay for it because for the last 2 or 3 years, you did it for me. Right?
Exactly.
Right. I mean, think about it from a grocery store perspective. You and I, 3 years ago, would get out of our car, we would grab a cart, we'd go around the store, we'd put all the stuff in the cart, we take it back out of the cart, we put it on the belt, and then we go pack our own stuff and we pack it in our own car. Well, all of that stuff is being done by the retailer now, and they were forced to do it as a result of the pandemic. And if the pandemic had lasted, 2 months like we were originally told, right? Okay, so that probably wouldn't have shifted from a behavior standpoint. But now all of a sudden, I never enjoyed grocery shopping to begin with, right? It's a chore. So the stuff that I want to go back into the store for is the stuff that I missed picking myself during the pandemic when we were locked down, right? Produce and meat for the barbecue, or fish or flowers for the wife, or whatever the case may be. That I want to shop for myself. But all the other stuff, case of water, right? I had an executive with a very large retailer tell me, and this was literally like, I don't know, 3 months ago. He's like, Mark, I am never going to be able to convince one of my shoppers to come into the store, wrestle a case of water off of the shelf, get it back up on the belt, get it back out to their car, right? Because I've been doing it for the last 2 years for free. Why would they? Right? And that's where all this automation comes in. All this automation is simply to, put their thumb in the dike, so to speak, to say, okay, I got to figure out a way to pick, pack, and ship faster, or at least pick, pack, and have it at the front of the store for you to pick up. Yep. And that's the end game, and that's what everyone's racing towards, and that's where all this automation comes into play. And it is, all joking aside, if I were trying to figure out what the right vendor was to work with, right, to your point, first of all, they keep shifting, right? And that's what happens with emerging technology. You see a whole bunch of providers show up, and then at the end of the day, there's 2 or 3 standing. But the problem is I can't wait until there's only 2 or 3 standing to make the decision, right? So it places an enormous amount of risk on a lot of these CTOs.
Absolutely. And that's, so there is the side of the retail store fulfillment, right? Like fulfilling from store, where, you walk into a Walmart, and I do have to say, as a consumer, because I actually enjoy grocery shopping the same way you do on the produce side, right? And every time I go there, it's while I'm shopping, there are these additional 2 or 3 people running around with their zebra guns, right? Like trying to pick an order for whichever service. It could be their own service, be it Instacart or Uber grocery delivery or whichever one it might be. And the experience wasn't as clean. But here's the flip side of the problem as well on that front is when you go to a micro-fulfillment, a separate center, right, the unit economics is a problem because the density that you kind of create will not give you the end unit economics that the consumer is expecting things today. But unfortunately, when you try to do it, you take a loss on that particular shipment. Already, grocery and produce being a slim margin business, now your opportunity is further diminished. And I think that's where the problem happens to be. And a lot of that was driven by some of the VC funded, and I like to call it OPM, right? Other people's money businesses, right? That actually gave away those deliveries for free during pandemic to get us used to it. But it's no longer from in a stable environment like today, and I wouldn't call it today a stable, but it's drastically changed. And I struggle with it a little bit today, right? Though I do have to say, more than just quicker delivery or quicker picking or processes, there is also the efficiency and labor market push. I think the labor market push is playing a more significant role in bringing in automation. And I know people don't want to touch that touchy subject, right? But that's what's happening, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things to sort of tug on there, right? Number one is the automation thing. You're absolutely right. They're trying to figure that out, right? And so there's one very large multinational retailer that I can't name, but I know the gentleman that runs their automation strategy. And what he knows exactly where I live, and he knows exactly the stores in my area and stuff like that. It's almost a little eerie how he knows that, but whatever. That's one. But he was like, listen, in your area with the volumes that the stores near you have, right, it doesn't make sense to put a micro-fulfillment center in the back of every store. But what I can do is I can put one in the back of one of those stores and then use that from a hub and spoke perspective to fulfill the other stores, because you as the end consumer don't care if it came from the store down the street, as long as the groceries that you ordered are there when you were told they're ready to be picked up, right? Agreed. So that's number one. Number two, it's all about that data, right? I mean, you mentioned Instacart, and I'm sure the folks from Instacart won't like me for saying this, but the reason that Instacart got pushed out of a lot of stores is because the deal with Instacart is Instacart operates on their own device, on their own application. So you may be shopping in a public store, for example, right? And you're going to use Instacart to do your shopping for whatever reason. You don't want to go to the store, whatever. All the data regarding what you're buying now resides on Instacart's server, not Publix's server, right? So Publix says, well, wait a second. I don't know what Mark's buying anymore because I don't see that data. And that's why Instacart ran into the trouble that they ran into. So, and then the third piece is the labor, right? I think, automation scares people, right? And that's okay. I mean, if you had seen at ProMat, I think it was Boston Dynamics had like humanoid.
Yeah.
Right. I looked at that and I was like, well, that's really cool from a geek standpoint, right? But then I'm standing there and I'm like, well, it's okay if it's on that side of the divider, right? But I don't want to be working alongside that thing. That thing's scary, right? But I think the thing around automation is you have to be able to communicate with your staff to say, look, I'm not bringing in automation to replace you. I'm bringing in automation to make your job easier, right? Because I want you interfacing with customers. That's what I pay you to do. I don't necessarily want you just picking boxes in the back of the store. And if you go at it in that way, then you have a better labor sort of participation. They feel better about the robotics being there. And they understand, hey, it's not that you want to take away my job. You actually value my job because you're actually making my job more fun It's like, because who wants to just sit there and pick boxes all day? I want to interact with consumers.
And I mean, if the business is right, in most cases, what we see, and we play around a lot with the automation, what we see in the market is actually the throughput increases, and you actually need more labor to do the labor side of the business. Now, you might need one less warehouse or something of that nature, right? But as far as that particular facility is concerned, the throughput goes up. There is still a lot of manual processes. The automation only applies to 10, 15, 20, 30% of the processes.
Correct.
You are going to need more people to do all the other functions that you do in the business. So I absolutely agree with you. Just, two other things, parallels that I wanted to draw. One, you mentioned the Instacart not giving you visibility to customer data. Amazon's got the same problem, by the way, right? Where, if you sell something on Amazon, use their channels to sell it, you don't have any data. You could be doing $500 million worth of business, but you have no idea who the customer happens to be. That's super interesting.
Well, and then there's the other myth that I keep laughing about every time I hear it. Well, brick and mortar is dead. Stores are going away.
Oh, no.
That's so ridiculous, right? I mean, we've been saying that for years, and I keep batting it down, and people that I interact with on LinkedIn, they keep batting it down as well. It's like, if anything, you see, IKEA mentioned it publicly, and IKEA is a customer, right? I mean, they're making a huge investment in stores in North America over the next couple of years, right? Think about it. How much furniture do you buy without actually touching and feeling it, right? I mean, are you really going to plunk down a couple of $1,000s for the couch in your den without putting your keister in it to make sure it's comfortable, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy, right? There are certain things that, work online. Furniture's not one of them, right? So, anyway.
I mean, Wayfair has made a dent in it, but I'll also tell you, let's look at the return rate of Wayfair for all of these big and bulky things that they end up selling. So, I've made furniture purchases, but I think in most cases, if I've gone to a store, it's a final purchase.
Yep.
If I go online and purchase a furniture, no word of a lie, I have actually put together a bunk bed that took me half a day to build and then another half a day to disassemble and send it back. All the margin, all the revenue, it's all gone at that point.
So I'm not sure if this is just a New York thing, but there is a cottage industry here of people that literally make money off of assembling furniture that arrives at people's houses unassembled. Because you open up the box and you look at the directions, and you're like, OMG, like there is no way that I have the skill set to put this together. Right? So it's like, okay, if I can hire someone, a gig worker, to come into my house and put it together, I'm there. No problem.
I would actually hire those people. So I think it could be a cottage industry everywhere. So
the other thing that you mentioned, which is interesting, is returns logistics, right? That just, unfortunately, that was one really bad impact of COVID, right? Because even people like myself who understand supply chain, who understand what a pain it is for me to return product, even I got to the point where I was ordering 2 or 3 of something and either sending 2 back or in some cases sending 3 back. And I know what that does to the retailer all too well, right? So I think that's the next area as we take a deep breath coming out of the pandemic. I think that's another area where you're going to see a lot of growth, because we simply have to figure out, and this is where visibility can help, we simply have to figure out, instead of shipping that shirt all the way back to the West Coast, because that's where the DC is, right? If the shirt is in perfectly good shape and it can just be put back on the shelf, right? Let me get it to a store that's only 15, 20 miles away and save some of that margin on that item, right? If it goes all the way back to the DC and you've got a winter coat, now the winter coat goes back to the store, but it's May, not going to work, right? Exactly.
Absolutely. And, you touched on a subject really close to my heart when it comes to returns dispositioning, returns routing. And it's all dependent on what is the consumer telling you. Why are they returning? What are they returning? And making a more predictive decision, similar to some of the predictive information that you kind of, you say, okay, this truck is actually going to be late based on the weather. It's the same way. What is the consumer saying? Why are you returning? And then making a decision to say, should this go back to that store? Because what if this customer ended up using this coat for a party? Because that happens a lot, right? And now we don't have dry cleaning services over there to be able to clean and put back on the shelf, right? So it's that type of decision making. And then there is the post-processing visibility and decision making as well. So let's say it does make it to the warehouse. What do I do with it? Yep. Do I put it on an online channel? Can I go ahead and do liquidation around it? Can I even do liquidation for this coat that is, really bougie and it has to be exclusive, right? Like, so it's all of these decisions. Yep. That's where the fun is. I completely agree with you.
Well, and not to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but I was listening to a gentleman from Neiman Marcus at the Real conference a few months ago, and he was talking about the whole fraud part of it, which honestly I didn't know was as big as it was. But if you think about a store like Neiman Marcus that attracts a very high-end consumer, there's a whole industry. You see them on the streets of Manhattan on the street corners, right? So you have a fake Gucci bag, and you package up that fake Gucci bag and you send it back to Neiman Marcus saying, well, I'm returning my Gucci bag. I'd like my $700 now.
Oh, wow.
Right, exactly. So now all of a sudden they've got to look at it and say, is this really a Gucci bag? And those folks, unfortunately, criminals have gotten pretty smart, right? So that's a whole other aspect of returns. That
oh my God. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Actually, I haven't heard of that one before.
Yeah. Which makes all the sense, by the way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Mark, this time has flown and great information, great insights. Really, really appreciate you joining us today. And just want to wrap up by giving you an opportunity to share with the listeners how they could follow you on social, whether that's LinkedIn, and how they could learn more about FourKites.
Sure. Well, very easy, FourKites.com for any information that you want around FourKites. I have a pretty significant presence on LinkedIn, so please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. More than happy to chat there. And obviously, I speak at a number of events, so if you see me, please, come up, shake my hand, because we are back to shaking hands. So I want to get to know
That's right. That's right.
As possible. So,
I look forward to shaking it in a couple of weeks at Momentum. So thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Yep.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to maximize your supply chain. Available on all major podcasting channels. Thank you for listening and see you in the next episode.